third Adhyaya of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, translated by Max Müller. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jyoti Taravanat. First Brahmana. Adoration to the highest self, Paramatman. Janaka Vaideha, the king of Vaidehas, sacrificed with a sacrifice at which many presents were offered to the priests of the Asvamedha. Brahmanas of the Kurus and the Panchalas had come thither, and Janaka Vaideha wished to know which of those Brahmanas was the best read. So he enclosed 1,000 cows, and 10 padas of gold were fastened to each pair of horns. And Janaka spoke to them, "Ye venerable Brahmanas, he who among you is the wisest, let him drive away these cows." Then those Brahmanas durst not, but Yagnavalkya said to his people, "Drive them away, my dear." He replied, "O glory to the salmon," and drove them away. The Brahmanas became angry and said, "How should he call himself the wisest among us?" Now there was Asvala, the Hotri priest of Janaka Vaideha. He asked him, "Are you indeed the wisest among us, O Yagnavalkya?" He replied, "I bow before the wisest, the best knower of Brahman, but I wish indeed to have those cows." Then Asvala, the Hotri priest, undertook to question him. "Yagnavalkya," he said, "everything here connected with the sacrifice is reached by death. Everything is overcome by death. By what means then is the sacrificer freed beyond the reach of death?" Yagnavalkya said, "By the Hotri priest, who is Agni, fire, who is speech. For speech is the Hotri of the sacrifice, or the sacrificer, and speech is Agni, and he is the Hotri. This constitutes freedom, and perfect freedom from death." "Yagnavalkya," he said, "everything here is reached by day and night. Everything is overcome by day and night. By what means then is the sacrificer freed beyond the reach of day and night?" Yagnavalkya said, "By the Advaryu priest, who is the eye, who is Aditya, the sun. For the eye is the Advaryu of the sacrifice, and the eye is the sun, and he is the Advaryu. This constitutes freedom and perfect freedom." "Yagnavalkya," he said, "everything here is reached by the waxing and waning of the moon. Everything is overcome by the waxing and waning of the moon. By what means then is the sacrificer freed beyond the reach of the waxing and waning of the moon?" Yagnavalkya said, "By the Udgatri priest, who is Vayu, the wind, who is the breath. For the breath is the Udgatri of the sacrifice, and the breath is the wind, and he is the Udgatri. This constitutes freedom and perfect freedom." "Yagnavalkya," he said, "the sky is, as it were, without an ascent staircase. By what approach does the sacrificer approach the Swarga world?" Yagnavalkya said, "By the Brahman priest, who is the mind, Manas, who is the moon. For the mind is the Brahman of the sacrifice, and the mind is the moon, and he is the Brahman. This constitutes freedom and perfect freedom. These are the common deliverances from death." Next follow the achievements. Yagnavalkya, he said, how many Rik verses will the Hotri priest employ today at this sacrifice? 3, replied Yagnavalkya. And what are these 3? Those which are called Puronovakya Yagna, and thirdly Sasya. And what does he gain by them? All whatsoever has breath. Yagnavalkya, he said, how many oblations Ahuti will the Advaryu priest employ today at this sacrifice? 3, replied Yagnavalkya. And what are these 3? Those which, when offered, flame up. Those which, when offered, make an excessive noise. And those which, when offered, sink down. What does he gain by them? By those which, when offered, flame up, he gains the Deva, God world. For the Deva world flames up, as it were. By those which, when offered, make an excessive noise, he gains the Pitri, father world. For the Pitri world is excessively noisy. By those which, when offered, sink down, he gains the Manushya, man world. For the Manushya world is, as it were, down below. Yagnavalkya, he said, with how many deities does the Brahman priest on the right protect today this sacrifice? By 1, replied Yagnavalkya. And which is it? The mind alone, for the mind is endless, and the Visvadevas are endless, and he thereby gains the endless world. Yagnavalkya, he said, how many Stotriya hymns will the Udgatri priest employ today at this sacrifice? 3, replied Yagnavalkya. And what are these 3? Those which are called Puronavakya, Yagya, and thirdly Sasya. And what are these with regard to the body, Adhyatman? The Puronavakya is Prana, up breathing; the Yagya, the Apana, down breathing; and Sasya, the Vyana, back breathing. What does he gain by them? He gains the earth by the Puronovakya, the sky by Yajna, heaven by the Sasya. After that, Asvala held his peace. Second Brahmana. Then Jaratkarva Arthabhaga asked him, Yagnavalkya, he said, how many grahas are there, and how many atigrahas? 8 grahas, he replied, and 8 atigrahas. And what are these 8 grahas and 8 atigrahas? Prana, breath, is 1 graha, and that is seized by Apana, down breathing, as the atigraha, for one smells with the Apana. Speech, Vak, is 1 graha, and that is seized by name, Naman, as the atigraha, for with speech one pronounces names. The tongue is 1 graha, and that is seized by the taste as the atigraha, for with the tongue one perceives tastes. The eye is 1 graha, and that is seized by form as the atigraha, for with the eye one sees forms. The ear is 1 graha, and that is seized by sound as the atigraha, for with the ear one hears sounds. The mind is one graha, and that is seized by desire as the atigraha. For with the mind one desires desires. The arms are one graha, and these are seized by work as the atigraha. For with the arms one works work. The skin is one graha, and that is seized by touch as the atigraha. For with the skin one perceives touch. These are the 8 grahas and the 8 atigrahas. Yagnavalkya, he said, everything is the food of death. What then is the deity to whom death is food? Fire, Agni, is death, and that is the food of water. Death is conquered again. Yagnavalkya, he said, when such a person, a sage, dies, do the vital breaths, pranas, move out of him or no? No, replied Yagnavalkya, they are gathered up in him. He swells, he is inflated, and thus inflated the dead lies at rest. Yagnavalkya, he said, when such a man dies, what does not leave him? The name, he replied, for the name is endless. The Visvadevas are endless, and by it he gains the endless world. Yagnavalkya, he said, when the speech of this dead person enters into the fire breath into the air, the eye into the sun, the mind into the moon, the hearing into space, into the earth the body, into the ether the self, into the shrubs the hairs of the body, into the trees the hairs of the head, when the blood and the seed are deposited in the water, where is then that person? Yagnavalkya said, take my hand, my friend, we two alone shall know of this. Let this question of ours not be discussed in public. Then these two went out and argued, and what they said was karman, work. What they praised was karma, namely that a man becomes good by good work and bad by bad work. After that, Jaratkarva Arthabhaga held his peace. Third Brahmana. Then Bhugyu Lahyayani asked, Yagnavalkya, he said, we wandered about as students and came to the house of Patanjala Kapya. He had a daughter who was possessed by a Gandharva. We asked him, who art thou? And he, the Gandharva, replied, I am Sudanvan, the Angirasa. And when we asked him about the ends of the world, we said to him, where were the Parikshitas? Where then were the Parikshitas? I ask thee, Yagnavalkya, where were the Parikshitas? Yagnavalkya said, he said to thee, I suppose, that they went where those go who have performed a horse sacrifice. He said, and where do they go who have performed a horse sacrifice? Yagnavalkya replied, 32 journeys of the car of the sun is this world. The earth surrounds it on every side, twice as large, and the ocean surrounds this earth on every side, twice as large. Now there is between them a space as large as the edge of a razor or the wing of a mosquito. Indra, having become a bird, handed them through the space to Vayu, the air, and Vayu, the air, holding them within himself, conveyed them to where they dwell who have performed a horse sacrifice. Somewhat in this way did he praise Vayu indeed. Therefore Vayu air is everything by itself, and Vayu is all things together. He who knows this conquers death. After that, Bhugya Lahyani held his peace. Fourth Brahmana. Then Ushasta Chakrayana asked, Yagnavalkya, he said, tell me the Brahman which is visible, not invisible, the self-Atman who is within all. Yagnavalkya replied, this thyself who is within all. Which self, O Yagnavalkya, is within all? Yagnavalkya replied, he who breathes in the up-breathing, he is thyself and within all. He who breathes in the down-breathing, he is thyself and within all. He who breathes in the on-breathing, he is thyself and within all. He who breathes in the out-breathing, he is thyself and within all. This is thyself who is within all. Ushasta Chakrayana said, as one might say, this is a cow, this is a horse, thus has this been explained by thee. Tell me the Brahman which is visible, not invisible, the self who is within all. Yagnavalkya replied, this thyself who is within all. Which self, O Yagnavalkya, is within all? Yagnavalkya replied, thou couldst not see the true seer of sight. Thou couldst not hear the true hearer of hearing, nor perceive the perceiver of perception, nor know the knower of knowledge. This is thyself who is within all. Everything also is of evil. After that, Ushasta Chakrayana held his peace. Fifth Brahmana. Then Kahola Kaushitakeya asked, Yagnavalkya, he said, tell me the Brahman which is visible, not invisible, the self-Atman who is within all. Yagnavalkya replied, this thyself who is within all. Which self, O Yagnavalkya, is within all? Yagnavalkya replied, he who overcomes hunger and thirst, sorrow, passion, old age and death. When Brahmanas know that self and have risen above the desire for sons, wealth and new worlds, they wander about as mendicants. For a desire for sons is desire for wealth. A desire for wealth is desire for worlds. Both these are indeed desires. Therefore let a Brahmana, after he has done with learning, wish to stand by real strength. After he has done with that strength and learning, he becomes a Muni, a Yogin. And after he has done with what is not the knowledge of a Muni, and with what is the knowledge of a Muni, he is a Brahmana. By whatever means he has become a Brahmana, he is such indeed. Everything else is of evil. After that, Kahola Kaushitakeya held his peace. Sixth Brahmana. Then Gargi Vajaknavi asked, Yagnavalkya, she said, everything here is woven like warp and woof in water. What then is that in which water is woven like warp and woof? In air, O Gargi, he replied. In what then is air woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of the sky, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of the sky woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of the Gandharvas, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of the Gandharvas woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of Aditya's son, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of Aditya's son woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of Chandra, moon, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of Chandra, moon, woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of the Nakshatras, stars, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of the Nakshatras, stars, woven like warp and woof? In the world of the Devas, gods, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of the Devas, gods, woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of Indra, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of Indra woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of Prajapati, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of Prajapati woven like warp and woof? In the worlds of Brahman, O Gargi, he replied. In what then are the worlds of Brahman woven like warp and woof? After that, Gargi Vachaknavi held her peace. Seventh Brahmana. Then Uddalaka Aruni asked, Yagnavalkya, he said, we dwelt among the Madras in the houses of Patanjala Kapya, studying the sacrifice. His wife was possessed of a Gandharva, and we asked him, Who art thou? He answered, I am Kabanda Atharvana. And he said to Panchala Kapya and to us students, Dost thou know, Kapya, that thread by which this world and the other world and all beings are strung together? And Patanjala Kapya replied, I do not know, sir. He said again to Patanjala Kapya and to us students, Dost thou know, Kapya, the Pula, ruler within Antrayaman, who within pulls rules this world and the other world and all beings? And Patanjala Kapya replied, I do not know it, sir. He said again to Patanjala Kapya and to us students, He, O Kapya, who knows that thread and him who pulls it within, he knows Brahman. He knows the worlds. He knows the Devas. He knows the Vedas. He knows the Bhutas, creatures. He knows the self. He knows everything. Thus did he, the Gandharva, say to them, and I know it. If thou, O Yagnavalkya, without knowing that string and the puller within, drivest away those Brahma cows, the cows offered as a prize to him who best knows Brahman, thy head will fall off. Yagnavalkya said, O Gautama, I believe I know that thread and the puller within. The other said, Anybody may say, I know, I know. Tell what thou knowest. Yagnavalkya said, Vayu air is that thread, O Gautama. By air as by a thread, O Gautama, this world and the other world and all creatures are strung together. Therefore, O Gautama, people say of a dead person that his limbs have become unstrung, for by air as by a thread, O Gautama, they were strung together. The other said, So it is, O Yagnavalkya. Tell now who is the puller within. Yagnavalkya said, He who dwells in the earth and within the earth, whom the earth does not know, whose body the earth is, and who rules the earth within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the water and within the water, whom the water does not know, whose body the water is, and who rules the water within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the fire and within the fire, whom the fire does not know, whose body the fire is, and who rules the fire within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the sky and within the sky, whom the sky does not know, whose body the sky is, and who rules the sky within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the air, Vayu, and within the air, whom the air does not know, whose body the air is, and who rules the air within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the heaven, Dew, and within the heaven, whom the heaven does not know, whose body the heaven is, and who rules the heaven within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the sun, Aditya, and within the sun, whom the sun does not know, whose body the sun is, and who rules the sun within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the space, Disa, and within the space, whom the space does not know, whose body the space is, and who rules the space within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the moon and stars, Chandrama Tarakam, and within the moon and stars, whom the moon and stars do not know, whose body the moon and stars are, and who rules the moon and stars within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the ether, Akasa, and within the ether, whom the ether does not know, whose body the ether is, and who rules the ether within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the darkness, Tamas, and within the darkness, whom the darkness does not know, whose body the darkness is, and who rules the darkness within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the light, Tejas, and within the light, whom the light does not know, whose body the light is, and who rules the light within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. So far with respect to the gods. Adidaivatam. Now with respect to beings. Adibhutam. Yagnavalkya said, He who dwells in all beings and within all beings, whom all beings do not know, whose body all beings are, and who rules all beings within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the breath, Prana, and within the breath, whom the breath does not know, whose body the breath is, and who rules the breath within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the tongue, Vak, and within the tongue, whom the tongue does not know, whose body the tongue is, and who rules the tongue within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the eye and within the eye, whom the eye does not know, whose body the eye is, and who rules the eye within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the ear and within the ear, whom the ear does not know, whose body the ear is, and who rules the ear within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the mind and within the mind, whom the mind does not know, whose body the mind is, and who rules the mind within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the skin and within the skin, whom the skin does not know, whose body the skin is, and who rules the skin within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in knowledge and within knowledge, whom knowledge does not know, whose body knowledge is, and who rules knowledge within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. He who dwells in the seed and within the seed, whom the seed does not know, whose body the seed is, and who rules the seed within. He is thyself, the puller, ruler within, the immortal. Unseen but seeing, unheard but hearing, unperceived but perceiving, unknown but knowing. There is no other seer but he. There is no other hearer but he. There is no other perceiver but he. There is no other knower but he. This is thyself, the ruler within, the immortal. Everything else is of evil. After that, Uddalaka Aruni held his peace. 8th Brahmana. Then Vachaknavi said, Venerable Brahmanas, I shall ask him 2 questions. If he will answer them, none of you, I think, will defeat him in any argument concerning Brahman. Yagnavalkya said, Ask, O Gargi. She said, O Yagnavalkya, as the son of a warrior from the Kasis or Vaidehas might string his loosened bow, take 2 pointed 4-piercing arrows in his hands, and rise to do battle, I have risen to fight thee with 2 questions. Answer me these questions. Yagnavalkya said, Ask, O Gargi. She said, O Yagnavalkya, that of which they say it is above the heavens, beneath the earth, embracing heaven and earth, past, present, and future. Tell me, in what is it woven, like warp and woof? Yagnavalkya said, That of which they say that it is above the heavens, beneath the earth, embracing heaven and earth, past, present, and future, that is woven like warp and woof, is the ether, Akasa. She said, I bow to thee, O Yagnavalkya, who hast solved me that question. Get thee ready for the second. Yagnavalkya said, Ask, O Gargi. She said, O Yagnavalkya, that of which they say that it is above the heavens, beneath the earth, embracing heaven and earth, past, present, and future. Tell me, in what is it woven, like warp and woof?" Yajnavalkya said, "That of which they say that it is above the heavens, beneath the earth, embracing heaven and earth, past, present, and future, that is woven like warp and woof in the ether." Gargi said, "In what then is the ether woven like warp and woof?" He said, "O Gargi, the Brahmanas call this the Akshara, the imperishable. It is neither coarse nor fine, neither short nor long, neither red like fire nor fluid like water. It is without shadow, without darkness, without air, without ether, without attachment, without taste, without smell, without eaves, without ears, without speech, without mind, without light, vigor, without breath, without a mouth or door, without measure, having no within and no without. It devours nothing, and no one devours it. By the command of that Akshara, the imperishable, O Gargi, sun and moon stand apart. By the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, heaven and earth stand apart. By the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, what are called moments, nimisha, hours, muhurta, days and nights, half months, months, seasons, years, all stand apart. By the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, some rivers flow to the east from the white mountains, others to the west, or to any other quarter. By the command of that Akshara, O Gargi, men praise those who give. The gods follow the sacrificer, the fathers the Dharvi offering. Whosoever, O Gargi, without knowing that Akshara, the imperishable, offers oblations in this world, sacrifices and performs penance for 1,000 years, his work will have an end. Whosoever, O Gargi, without knowing this Akshara, departs this world, he is miserable like a slave. But he, O Gargi, who departs this world, knowing this Akshara, he is a Brahmana. That Brahman, O Gargi, is unseen, but seeing, unheard, but hearing, unperceived, but perceiving, unknown, but knowing. There is nothing that sees but it, nothing that hears but it, nothing that perceives but it, nothing that knows but it. In that Akshara, then, O Gargi, the ether is woven like warp and woof. Then said Gargi, "Venerable Brahmans, you may consider it a great thing if you get off by bowing before him. No one, I believe, will defeat him in any argument concerning Brahman." After that, Vachaknavi held her peace. Ninth Brahmana. Then Vidagdha Sakalya asked him, "How many gods are there, O Yajnavalkya?" He replied with this very Nivid, "As many as are mentioned in the Nivid of the hymn of praise addressed to the Visvadevas, namely 3 and 300, 3 and 3,000. Yes, he said, and asked him, "How many gods are there really, O Yajnavalkya?" 33, he said. Yes, he said, and asked him, "How many gods are there really, O Yajnavalkya?" 6, he said. Yes, he said, and asked again, "How many gods are there really, O Yajnavalkya?" 3, he said. Yes, he said, and asked again, how many gods are there really, O Yagnavalkya? 2, he said. Yes, he said, and asked again, how many gods are there really, O Yagnavalkya? 1.5. Adhyartha, he said. Yes, he said, and asked again, how many gods are there really, O Yagnavalkya? 1, he said. Yes, he said, and asked, who are these 3 and 300, 3 and 3,000? Yagnavalkya replied, they are only the various powers of them. In reality, there are only 33 gods. He asked, who are those 33? Yagnavalkya replied, the 8 Vasus, the 11 Rudras, the 12 Adityas, they make 31. And Indra and Prajapati make the 33. He asked, who are the Vasus? Yagnavalkya replied, Agni, fire; Prithvi, earth; Vayu, air; Antariksha, sky; Aditya, sun; Dew, heaven; Chandramas, moon; the nakshatras, stars. These are the Vasus, for in them all that dwells this world rests, and therefore they are called Vasus. He asked, who are the Rudras? Yagnavalkya replied, these 10 vital breaths, pranas, the senses, that is, the 5 jnanendriyas and the 5 karmendriyas, and Atman as the 11th. When they depart from this mortal body, they make us cry, Rodayanti, and because they make us cry, they are called Rudras. He asked, who are the Adityas? Yagnavalkya replied, the 12 months of the year, and they are Adityas because they move along Yanti, taking up everything, Adhana. Because they move along taking up everything, therefore they are called Adityas. He asked, and who is Indra, and who is Prajapati? Yagnavalkya replied, Indra is Tanda, Prajapati is the sacrifice. He asked, and what is the Tanda? Yagnavalkya replied, the thunderbolt. He asked, and what is the sacrifice? Yagnavalkya replied, the sacrificial animals. He asked, who are the 6? Yagnavalkya replied, Agni, fire; Prithvi, earth; Vayu, air; Antariksha, sky; Aditya, sun; Dew, heaven. They are the 6, for they are all this, the 6. He asked, who are the 3 gods? Yagnavalkya replied, these 3 worlds, for in them all these gods exist. He asked, who are the 2 gods? Yagnavalkya replied, food and breath. He asked, who is the 1 god and a half? Yagnavalkya replied, he that blows. Here they say, how is it that he who blows like one only should be called 1.5, Adhyartha? And the answer is, because when the wind was blowing, everything grew, Adhyardhanat. He asked, who is the 1 god? Yagnavalkya replied, breath, prana, and he is Brahman, the Sutratman, and they call him that Triad. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that person or God, whose dwelling body is the earth, whose sight world is fire, whose mind is light, the principle of every living self, He indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya said, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest. This corporal, material, earthy person, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata, deity? Sakalya replied, the immortal. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that person whose dwelling is love, a body capable of sensual love, whose sight is the heart, whose mind is light, the principle of every self, he indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya replied, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest. This love-making, loving person, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata? Sakalya replied, the women. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that a person whose dwelling are the colors, whose sight is the eye, whose mind is light, the principle of every self, he indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya replied, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest. That person in the sun, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata? Sakalya replied, the true. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that person whose dwelling is ether, whose sight is the ear, whose mind is light, the principle of every self, he indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya said, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest. The person who hears and answers, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata? Sakalya replied, space. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that person whose dwelling is darkness, whose sight is the heart, whose mind is light, the principle of every self, he indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya replied, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest. The shadowy person, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata? Sakalya replied, death. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that person whose dwelling are bright colors, whose sight is the eye, whose mind is light, the principle of every self, he indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya replied, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest. The person in the looking glass, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata? Sakalya replied, vital breath, Asu. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that person whose dwelling is water, whose sight is the heart, whose mind is light, the principle of every self, he indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya replied, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest. The person in the water, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata? Sakalya replied, Varuna. Sakalya said, whosoever knows that person whose dwelling is seed, whose sight is the heart, whose mind is light, the principle of every self, he indeed is a teacher, O Yagnavalkya. Yagnavalkya replied, I know that person, the principle of every self, of whom thou speakest, the filial person, he is he. But tell me, Sakalya, who is his Devata? Sakalya replied, Prajapati. Yagnavalkya said, Sakalya, did those Brahmanas, who themselves shrank from the contest, make thee the victim? Sakalya said, Yagnavalkya, because thou hast decried the Brahmanas of the Kuru Panchalas, what Brahman dost thou know? Yagnavalkya said, I know the quarters with their deities and their abodes. Sakalya said, if thou knowest the quarters with their deities and their abodes, which is thy deity in the eastern quarter? Yagnavalkya said, Aditya, the sun. Sakalya said, in what does that Aditya abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the eye. Sakalya said, in what does the eye abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the colors, for with the eye he sees the colors. Sakalya said, and in what then do the colors abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the heart, for we know colors by the heart, for colors abide in the heart. Sakalya said, so it is indeed, O Yagnavalkya. Sakalya said, which is thy deity in the southern quarter? Yagnavalkya said, Yama. Sakalya said, in what does that Yama abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the sacrifice. Sakalya said, in what does the sacrifice abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the dakshina, the gifts to be given to the priests. Sakalya said, in what does the dakshina abide? Yagnavalkya said, in Shraddha, faith. For if a man believes that he gives dakshina, and dakshina truly abides in faith. Sakalya said, and in what then does faith abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the heart. For by the heart faith knows, and therefore faith abides in the heart. Sakalya said, so it is indeed, O Yagnavalkya. Sakalya said, which is thy deity in the western quarter? Yagnavalkya said, Varuna. Sakalya said, in what does that Varuna abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the water. Sakalya said, in what does the water abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the seed. Sakalya said, and in what does the seed abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the heart. And therefore also they say of a son who is like his father, that he seems as if slipped from his heart, or made from his heart. For the seed abides in the heart. Sakalya said, so it is indeed, O Yagnavalkya. Sakalya said, which is thy deity in the northern quarter? Yagnavalkya said, Soma. Sakalya said, in what does that Soma abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the Diksha. Sakalya said, in what does that Diksha abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the true. And therefore they say to one who has performed the Diksha, speak what is true, for in the true indeed the Diksha abides. Sakalya said, and in what does the true abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the heart. For with the heart do we know what is true, and in the heart indeed the true abides. Sakalya said, so it is indeed, O Yagnavalkya. Sakalya said, which is thy deity in the zenith? Yagnavalkya said, Agni. Sakalya said, in what does that Agni abide? Yagnavalkya said, in speech. Sakalya said, and in what does speech abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the heart. Sakalya said, and in what does the heart abide? Yagnavalkya said, O Ahilika, when you think the heart could be anywhere else away from us, if it were away from us, the dogs might eat it, or the birds tear it. Sakalya said, and in what dost thou, thy body, and the self, thy heart, abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the prana, breath. Sakalya said, in what does the prana abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the Apana, down breathing. Sakalya said, in what does the Apana abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the Vyana, back breathing. Sakalya said, in what does the Vyana abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the Udana, the out breathing. Sakalya said, in what does the Udana abide? Yagnavalkya said, in the Samana. That self, Atman, is to be described by no. He is incomprehensible, for he cannot be, is not comprehended. He is imperishable, for he cannot perish. He is unattached, for he does not attach himself. Unfettered, he does not suffer, he does not fail. These are the 8 abodes, the earth, etc., the 8 worlds, fire, etc., the 8 gods, the immortal food, etc., the 8 persons, the corporal, etc. He who, after dividing and uniting these persons, went beyond the Samana, that person taught in the Upanishads, I now ask thee to teach me. If thou shalt not explain him to me, thy head will fall. Sakalya did not know him, and his head fell. Nay, thieves took away his bones, mistaking them for something else. Then Yagnavalkya said, Reverend Brahmanas, whosoever among you desires to do so, may now question me, or question me, all of you, or whosoever among you desires it, I shall question him, or I shall question all of you. But those Brahmanas durst not say anything. Then Yagnavalkya questioned them with these slokas. As a mighty tree in the forest, so in truth is man. His hairs are the leaves, his outer skin is the bark. From his skin flows forth blood, sap from the skin of the tree, and thus from the wounded man comes forth blood, as from a tree that is struck. The lumps of his flesh are in the tree, the layers of wood. The fibre is strong like the tendons. The bones are the hard wood within. The marrow is made like the marrow of the tree. But while the tree, when felled, grows up again, more young, from the root, from what root, tell me, does a mortal grow up after he has been felled by death? Do not say from seed, for seed is produced from the living. But a tree springing from a grain clearly rises again after death. If a tree is pulled up with the root, it will not grow again. From what root then, tell me, does a mortal grow up after he has been felled by death? Once born, he is not born again, for who should create him again? Brahman, who is knowledge and bliss, he is the principal, both to whom who gives gifts, and also to him who stands firm and knows. End of 3rd Adhyaya. Recording by Jyoti Taravanat.